Hi, I'm Funmi Fetto. This is On Reflection, the beauty podcast with a global view on beauty, in association with Sunday Riley, certified B Corp, cruelty-free skincare, powered by science, balanced by botanicals. Later in the show, I'll be joined by Renee Engel. She's the psychology professor behind the best-selling book, Beauty Sick. She's here to explain why she deems the cultural obsession with looks a psychological illness. But first, required reading. This is a section of the show where we discuss the beauty stories and features that have piqued our interest. Joining me today, Anita Bagwandas. She's Glamour's beauty director at large. Anita, welcome.
Hi, Funmi. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you so much for coming on. So our first story, it's around the issue of cultural appropriation within the beauty industry. And we have a couple of stories tying into this. One is a feature that you wrote for Glamour called How Wellness Got Whitewashed. And then there's another story, which is an Instagram post by MasterChef judge Melissa Lung. And she's MasterChef Australia, for anyone who doesn't know. She put up a post on Instagram slamming the beauty industry for cultural appropriation.
Yeah, it's such an interesting one. I believe, and I might have this wrong, Melissa has written about this from the perspective of a food expert as well before. So it's quite interesting that she's looking at beauty now. What she was drawing attention to was somebody using a jade facial roller and calling it a skin fitness tool. The person who was doing that was a white person and didn't sort of pay any homage or reference to the fact that that tool is actually from gua sha used in traditional Chinese medicine. So she linked it to a piece in Glamour that I wrote, which was called How Wellness Got Whitewashed. It's a big topic. Beauty in particular is quite often been pulled up for cultural appropriation in different ways. But it's the first time that wellness within that is really being looked at. I thought Melissa's points and issues are really valid and definitely something to be discussed.
Talk to me about your piece, because not everybody would have read that. And I highly recommend everyone go and read the piece because I think it's brilliantly written and it's incredibly insightful and it gives a lot of food for thought. Anita, talk through the points that you make within that piece.
They come from the perspective of someone who is Indian and has seen their culture being appropriated in very different ways, from me going to launches and having things sold back to me as an Indian person. So it might be an Ayurvedic practice that's been sort of sold back to me as this new thing without any reference to where that has come from and the culture and the country that has come from. So there are first person elements within this piece discussing cultural appropriation in wellness, but it really is just holding the wellness industry to account for all the ways that it takes from different cultures without paying back directly.
You made so many valid points within the piece. There's been a conversation around white people and the beauty industry that have appropriated and capitalized, I guess, on elements specific to, say, Black culture and Black bodies. So, lip fillers to make lips more full, cornrows, tanning to look much more exotic or racially ambiguous. All of those kind of things we've talked about. Talking about how other cultures are repackaged, I guess, in whiteness, almost to make them more palatable. But what hasn't really been talked about enough, I don't think, is the whitewashing of wellness and just how much Asian culture is appropriated and co-opted by the West. I think, as you mentioned, the issue with all of these things is that the culture is appropriated, but then it's not attributed to the right source. You mentioned in your piece, actually, this is the kind of thing that's embodied by the likes of women like Gwyneth Paltrow. They take ownership of these practices, these rituals that are intrinsic in so many cultures and have been part of the history of many cultures for many, many years. In your piece, you mentioned an interview where she said, I went to a yoga class in LA and the 22-year-old girl behind the counter was like, have you ever done yoga before? I mean, I'm thinking, didn't she recognize Gwyneth? But anyway, and I was like, you have this job because I've done yoga before. It's like Melissa Lung said, let's keep selling people of color down the river by having attractive white women sell us back our culture in cute pink packaging and nice fonts. The awful thing is that I think most people don't actually realize they're doing it. Companies realize they're doing it. This is an industry that completely capitalizes on part of people's heritage and part of people's cultures. but they have fed it into a concept of beauty that is inherently white. So surely brands as well as individuals need to take responsibility here.
Absolutely. And brands are very responsible for cultural appropriation in this area. So one interesting thing was last National Yoga Day or Global Yoga Day, I can't remember what it was called. Lots of brands would post pictures of whatever they thought represented yoga. And invariably, it would be a picture of a class of people doing yoga who were all straight-sized, who were all white, who were very much that phrase, yoga bunny, which kind of makes you think of a very slim, tall, white, Californian-looking person. That is who yoga is marketed to. So it's taken away from people of colour and it's taken away from the Indian culture where it comes from. And it is literally just being marketed to white people. And that is the issue. And that translates from everything from, as I said, how National Yoga Day was portrayed to the biggest yoga stars in the world are mostly white. Everything from, the way that yoga culture and everything about yoga in particular has now sort of been taken away from that spiritual Indian heritage. And it's such a shame because obviously it doesn't pay homage to its origins, but it also really, it means that people don't feel like they're welcome within yoga. So I personally would feel quite scared to go to, one of these really, really fancy yoga classes somewhere, I don't know, in West London or something like that, because I know walking into that room, there probably wouldn't be that many people that look like me in that class. And that's such a shame because, that comes from my cultural heritage. So I think that is the issue, is when things become so elitist that people who don't fit within that very standard, narrow remit of what's acceptable don't fit in to, those classes or don't feel welcome in those classes. And that's such a shame.
I find that there's something quite arrogant about it. When these wellness rituals and practices are taken on, in many ways, the message seems to be, we've taken your culture, but we're going to tweak this because it's not good enough as it is, and we will elevate it. We can fix it. I think about how a lot of luxury brands have done that with street culture. So yeah, I totally agree with you. It's imperative that this is addressed and we have to speak quite openly about this. One of the things that came to mind is whether there is authentically a way of appreciating another culture's practices, wellness practices, without appropriating it. And I know in your piece, you talk about accepting and embracing without embellishing, as I was just saying now, embracing without embellishing or altering it. And I agree wholeheartedly with that. That said, I can't help but think that, that stereotypical person who goes on a sabbatical to India and then comes back with this knowledge, quote unquote, and appreciation for the culture. And now they practice yoga and they teach yoga and they go around saying namaste and they drink turmeric lattes and they do it all with such earnestness and such sincerity. So what do we do with that?
I do think that is sincere, and it's, it's really lovely that people, really love Asian cultures and, all kinds of different cultures. But I guess in this specific example that people really love Indian culture, that's great. But I think the issue is hopefully after, the last year, people really should know that it is harder for people of colour to get those opportunities and to take up space in the same way on social media, etc. So if you are someone who is, practicing in that realm, and you're not from that background, I do think you need to be very careful to keep paying homage to the origins of that culture. So if we use yoga as the example, or even Ayurveda or anything like that, if you're somebody who's not from an Indian background doing that, I do think you need to make sure you reference other people who do that work, who are Indian in that sector, so that you can sort of bring them up alongside yourself. I think you need to donate monetarily. This is just my point of view and it might sound controversial, but I do think if you are somebody who isn't from that culture and you are profiting from it, so if you are somebody who is white and you're doing Ayurveda, for example, you need to give back monetarily to that country. And why I think that's so important is because it's so easy to sort of just take things from different cultures as part of a spiritual journey. But those countries are quite often going through a lot economically. And I think if you can give back, you should, particularly if we look at the legacy, in this very specific example, the legacy that colonialism has left on India. I think that's why I find this quite hard, particularly is when you see people taking from Indian culture continuously, it's very hard to sort of justify that alongside the fact that the country was left in a complete state at the hands of the British, and so many atrocities. With the very specific example of Ayurvedic practitioners and doctors were banned and reprimanded very violently for practicing Ayurveda. So you have to give back monetarily, I believe. And if you are getting your materials, etc., I think you should try and do those from an Indian, obviously an ethical and, a sustainable Indian source, so that you have that link to the original culture, and you are giving back, and you are also lifting people up in different ways.
Our next story is all about slow beauty. This is a piece in Vogue India by Hasina Khatib, and it's called Why Slow Beauty is a New Clean Beauty. Slow beauty, essentially, it's a movement which is, I guess, encouraging us to be much more conscious, not just in how we consume beauty, but exactly what we consume.
I chose this piece because I think slow beauty really is the way forward. And we've seen the sort of slow movement move through food, through people buying locally and buying organic where they can, etc., and doing the best they can, basically, and through fashion, where people are trying to move away from fast fashion and buy more vintage, buy more secondhand, etc. And those same principles seem to be coming through to beauty. And I think that's really brilliant and something that I really believe in. There are lots of principles, I guess, within slow beauty. No one has really defined it, and I don't really believe in that anyway. You should define these things for yourself. But I really like that the idea of slow beauty, which to me kind of means, just buying things with a little bit more intention, making sure you don't overbuy, I think is one of the most crucial things. And this is something I really feel at the moment, is that there is just such an onslaught, and it feels like an onslaught to me, of beauty products out there. And as a beauty journalist, that's how I feel. So I can't even imagine how a consumer feels, just paralyzed by the huge amount of choice and so much out there, that I just think we need to pull it all back and just be a little bit more mindful and a bit more careful about what we're picking up and why we're picking it up.
We've talked a lot about this on the show, this movement to minimalize how we do beauty, how we buy products, how we consider products, and also the impact that all of this has on the environment. We have to be so much more conscious and so much more intentional in the ways we shop. So there are lots of elements of slow beauty that absolutely make sense to me. There is another side to it, however, that I find is just a little bit dubious. We box things into a particular trend, and it just becomes this thing to kind of make money. It's also kind of slightly irritating to me, the way that slow beauty is associated with goodness. There's an aspect of fast beauty that I think is negative, i.e., the constant buy mindset. But there's another aspect of beauty that people talk about, which is instant gratification, or beauty that isn't produced in small batches. And they tout that as a really evil thing. And that's obviously not necessarily the case. Also, we have to look at the fact that, buying more organic, buying small batches usually means spending more. So immediately it becomes quite elitist, and it immediately cuts out a huge number of people. So I think affordability also plays a part in this.
Yeah, I would agree, actually. That's one of my biggest sort of issues with anything to do with this, is that not everyone can afford to be eco-conscious, and that goes across everything from food to fashion to lifestyle to everything. For me, slow beauty is less about buying small batch. That's great if you want to do that, and you can do that. It doesn't have to be all one thing and all the other thing. You can kind of meet in the middle. You can buy some things at a small batch, but you can buy other things that are sort of more mass market. That's fine. I think for me, it's just about using what you've got, I think, is one of the biggest things, which sounds really basic. But I just think so many of us are being bombarded by all this skincare and all these people talking about skincare and, all these adverts and everything. I just think there's a real argument for using what you've got, particularly because so much of it will go off in a year's time or in 6 months' time. The other thing I think is trying as best as we can to eradicate anything that's single use. I think is sort of more of an entry-level step into the whole slow beauty thing and the whole eco-beauty thing as well. I think that's probably one of the more achievable things that everyone can kind of, do to a certain extent. I'm not saying you have to do everything within that, but if you can try not to use sheet masks. If you can, switch out cotton pads for reusable, washable ones. If you can, try to buy stuff that can be refilled. I think that is a really nice way into it. And it does make you think a little bit more about what you're doing. But yeah, I totally agree with what you said. Not everyone can be in that situation, but I do think we can all just use things a little bit more sparingly in some ways, but also a little bit more mindfully, I guess is the word.
That's really good advice. Yeah. I mean, everyone can do with being less wasteful. So absolutely, I totally agree with that. I thought it's interesting that Bobbi Brown has launched this new brand. By the way, for those listening, this is referring to Bobbi Brown, the person, not Bobbi Brown, the brand. She's since left the brand and it's now owned by the Lauder Company. So her new brand is called Jones Road. And I feel like she's got the right idea, actually. She gave an interview to the Wall Street Journal, and the brand isn't actually available here as of yet. She talked about the brand, and it's all about minimalism, paring everything back. And the great thing is that it's also affordable, which a lot of these brands aren't. What I did think was interesting, and this is just a little side note, considering that she founded Bobbi Brown, which for me, I've always looked at Bobbi Brown as a brand as incredibly inclusive. It felt slightly odd to me that she had pinned her entire look and feel of the brand on an aesthetic, which is, for anyone who knows the fashion brand Celine, old Celine was under a creative director called Phoebe Philo, and it had a very specific aesthetic that was very much adopted by a very white and a very elitist crowd. And it's interesting that that's her point of reference. I just think for a brand that I've normally associated with inclusivity, it just felt a little bit weird.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And that was what I picked up on as well, actually. And also, I think it's sort of based, and, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's based on that sort of whole like Hamptons vibe. So, very natural and not too done up, and sort of the look of that very white, very affluent crowd that would hang out in the Hamptons in America, that sort of very luxury elitist crowd. And I just think, oh, that's a shame, because it kind of goes back to what we were talking about in terms of cultural appropriation. It's constantly selling to that rich white woman. It does feel like it does sort of tap into that a little bit.
Yeah, that was a very odd one. Anyway, we move. Our final piece is about celebrity skincare brands. You've picked a piece that was in Refinery 29, and it's written by Bethany Fulton, and it's called Celebrity Skincare is Booming, but How Far Can You Trust the Products? I actually wrote a piece not too long ago, actually, about the celebrity skincare trend. I thought it was interesting the way that we've moved away from celebrity fragrances. I mean, yes, they're still coming out and they're still there, but the trend seems to be celebrities launching skincare. I have lots of thoughts about it, but I wanted to ask you, I mean, do you think that we still care? Are we still interested?
Sort of a little bit conflicted with this one, which is kind of why I picked it. I thought the piece was really brilliant. There was lots to think about. But one thing for me is when people are buying into a brand that is created by a celebrity, I don't know, for me, I just personally want a brand that is created by an expert. And that might just be me. I want my skincare in particular to be created by somebody who really, really knows what they're doing. I also want it to be unique, and I want it to be different and to be, top of the market in terms of the technology behind it. And yeah, I guess maybe not all of the celebrity brands fall into that as such. They're much more of an aesthetic thing, which is also fine. I am totally cool with that. But quite often they're sort of just part of a trend and maybe not that great in terms of ingredients.
I think now the way that celebrities launch skincare brands, or the way that celebrities launch beauty brands, I should say, is very different. I think you do have some people who launch it because they feel that things will sell off the back of their celebrity. And to an extent, they're right. But I think that's changing quite a lot. I think the consumer now is so much more demanding, and they require so much more. They require efficacious formulations, they require transparency, they require values that match their own, and they're shopping in a completely different way. And I think there are some brands that have completely tapped into that. I do think there are some brands that just happen to be fronted by a celebrity, but it's also a celebrity who's really passionate about the brand, really passionate about ingredients and how the brand works. And also they've got experts on board. And that's where I think they're really, really savvy. You know, Pharrell is a very good example of that. I mean, you look at Pharrell and automatically, you know, you kind of think, wow, his skin is amazing. And he's always talked about the importance of skincare and that sort of thing. He's always shown an interest in it. And then when he decided to launch Human Race, and he did that alongside his dermatologist, I think that also gave it the added kudos. So when you have something like that, I think people trust that much more. Even with Victoria Beckham, you know, she hasn't launched a lot of skincare, but she did that with Augustinus Bader. And I think people seeing that immediately took it a little bit more seriously than, say, if maybe she just launched it on her own. Even if she launched it with the best formulas, it was just having those experts on board. So I do think that those things make a difference. I don't think all celebrity skincare is equal. The smart ones understand that you can't just launch it on the back of your fame. It's not enough. I think it would have worked before, but right now it's just not enough.
I totally agree, actually. They're not all created equally. And those are two great examples. I totally agree. Having those experts on board is really great and really brilliant. I guess for me, one of the issues with celebrity beauty brands, and this is a totally natural, normal thing, and, you know, I definitely do this as well if I don't catch myself, is that we're sometimes buying into that celebrity rather than the products themselves. So we are buying into a slice of their life, or what they, you know, their perceived life, because obviously we know their lives aren't exactly like they look on Instagram, etc. And I think that's the issue for me with that, is that when we're buying into things that aren't real, and we don't see that real side to somebody, so we think that this cream, and I, you know, I do this all the time, and I'm a beauty journalist, and I know what goes behind these products and all this marketing and stuff like this, but you sort of buy into a slice of that glamour. And that's nothing new. You know, people were buying Erno Laszlo, who was a Hungarian dermatologist, who did a lot of the old Hollywood celebrities like Marilyn and that sort of thing. People were buying those products because of Marilyn and stuff like that back in the day, Marilyn Monroe. But I do think there is a bit of a risk when celebrities are potentially saying, this skincare is amazing, or this beauty is amazing, it will make you look like me. But then they don't allude to potentially the amount of plastic surgery they might have had, or, you know, the huge amount of cosmetic injectables they've had, or all the other factors that go into making a celebrity beautiful. Everything from their hair extensionist to their facialist to their dermatologist on call. And I think that's where we're sometimes buying into something that isn't necessarily there. And I'm not saying that's the case for all celebrity brands, because there are loads that I like, and I really like Victoria Beckham Beauty and I really like Fenty. But I do think there is a bit of an element of that where this sort of natural beauty is being portrayed as something that you can buy in a way.
It's funny you should say that about you being caught up slightly in this dream, I guess, that celebrity skincare brands or beauty brands sell. I always think that you're a little bit more cynical than that. But I mean, I totally hear what you're saying. I think that these days, you know, in order to launch a skincare brand that has any kind of longevity, you need credibility. I don't know whether people are falling for it as they once used to. I think people are so much more savvy. People are so much more engaged. They research so much more. And even if they initially buy into it just out of curiosity, I don't think they're loyal to it if it's not a good product. I think fundamentally it has to be a good product. There's just too much choice out there now at the moment for you to come out with a sloppy product that doesn't do anything. And people are so much more aware that a lot of celebrities don't use just olive oil. We know who we're talking about, to make themselves look a certain way. We know that they see their dermatologist and their facialist and their glam squad, and they're getting stuff done and so on. And that's absolutely fine if that's what they choose to do. I think what's irritating is the lack of transparency when they're trying to sell the product as something that makes them look a certain way when we all know that's not true. But I do think that people understand that a little bit more. I don't think people are so caught up with a celebrity that they believe absolutely everything they say.
I totally agree with that particular olive oil. That example is very true, because, you know, that person looks amazing, and it would be great to have less of that smokescreen, to see some of that realness. But just going back to what you were saying about, me being a little bit more cynical, ultimately above everything else, despite being a beauty journalist, I am a beauty consumer and I sort of buy into stuff like everyone else. And I think that's quite important because it means that I know what the consumer is going through when they're buying stuff.
Come to think of it now, I probably am not as cynical as I think I am, because just the other week I was saying how much I'm going to love Dolly Parton's perfume, and I haven't smelt it. I have no idea what the notes are going to be, but I will definitely be buying it. So yeah, I probably am not as cynical as I claim to be. Anita, thank you so much. It's been so much fun having you on the show.
Amazing. Thank you for having me.
It's now time for In Praise Of, where we laud the merits of a single beauty product. This week, it's Sunday Riley's Good Genes. No matter how many times you read about or watch how to give yourself a facial at home, I don't know, it never quite stands up to the workmanship of a skilled facialist. I know many would argue that facials are a luxury, and yes, I do concur, but only to a degree. I would argue that seeing a brilliant facialist every couple of months will not only give you brilliant skin and better skin, it's actually financial wisdom. It'll save you tons of money and tons of time on useless skincare products and make the really good ones that you actually use work better and harder for you. But right now, stuck at home, that's neither here or there. Thankfully, there's Good Genes. Now, I have to say, I'm obsessed with this product. It's a mask meets moisturizer meets treatment, although you apply it like you would a normal serum. And it deeply exfoliates the skin, but it doesn't dry it out. And I can tell you this, I honestly start seeing changes to my skin overnight. It's got a stellar cast of ingredients. There's a lactic acid salt, which exfoliates while also boosting skin's natural moisturizing factors. There's licorice. Now, I can't stand licorice sweets, but as a skincare ingredient, it's actually one of my absolute faves. I don't know why people don't use it more. It's brilliant for brightening. Then there's prickly pear, which instantly soothes your skin. But the star of the show is glycolic acid. It's a different kind of glycolic acid because it's been processed in a way that doesn't leave trace amounts of formaldehyde, which can be toxic. And also, unlike most other glycolic acid products, it's not irritating and it's not harsh. So aside from those with incredibly sensitive skin, I reckon it can be used universally. It decongests your skin, it refines your texture, it treats pigmentation issues, and it smooths out fine lines, and it does all of that really, really brilliantly. So I call it a facial in a bottle. Okay, so I know it's not quite the same as, say, a 2-hour treatment under the magical hands of a trained facialist, but you know what? This is as good as it gets. Now, talking points. My guest today is Dr. Renee Engel. She's an award-winning professor of psychology at Northwestern University in Illinois. For the past 15 years, she has dedicated herself to studying girls' and women's struggles with beauty and body image. Her TED Talk addressing this issue has almost 800,000 views. She's also the author of a brilliant book, Beauty Sick: How the Cultural Obsession with Appearance Hurts Girls and Women. She's here to discuss the damaging repercussions of a society that focuses so heavily on women's appearances and why she calls our relationship with body image a sickness. Dr. Renee, thank you so much for being here. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk with you.
So I'd love you to describe exactly what you mean by beauty sickness.
Sure. So when I say beauty sickness, I'm not talking about a literal illness that you go to the doctor for. What I'm talking about is more of what I would call a cultural disease. And beauty sickness to me is what happens when you become so worried about how you look that those worries take really essential time and energy and resources away from the things that matter most to you. So just like other types of illness that can keep you from doing the things you want to do and being the type of person you want to be, our fears and our worries about beauty can do that to us as well.
I know you've been studying body image for many years now, but at what point do you think actually the world needs to know about this?
Well, I would say I was convinced somewhat under duress. So I spend a lot of time teaching. The most important part of my job is teaching. And I got into this area of research because I was so worried about so many of my students. And so for a long time, I did my research and I mostly talked about it with my students who were sort of traditional college age women, maybe, 18 to 22 years old. And I sort of felt like that's my audience and that's cool and that's fine. And then I was approached by a literary agent, and over a period of 3 years, she wore me down, and meeting after meeting. And finally, I decided, okay, maybe I'll do this. This might be fun to be able to bring some of these ideas to a bigger audience and try to find a way to communicate these scientific findings in a way that feels meaningful and important to people and in a way they can really feel. So that's what I was trying to do with Beauty Sick.
You've talked about your experience with the female students you were teaching in postgrad school. And I think this was an experience that goes back probably 20 years now. You were saying that the more you listened to them, the more you saw that what they were focused on was quite troubling. They were spending a lot of time, an alarming amount of time, talking about their physical appearance and modifying their physical appearance. And one of the things that you said is that your issue wasn't so much that they wanted to be beautiful, but they seemed to overrule this over every other goal that they had. And this was what inspired you to start really studying the impact of imagery on how women view their bodies. Initially, at least, what were your most alarming findings?
The moment I remember most is when a student told me that she hadn't come to class because she was having an ugly day. At the time, I had no words. I didn't know how to respond to that. I was so young when I started teaching. I'm not sure I really knew what I was doing. And I think I just kind of laughed like, I had an ugly day. But I kept thinking about it and thinking about it and, wondering, what does that mean when you don't go to class because you feel too unattractive, because you feel like people are going to judge you. And I really started listening to the young women I was around more and more. And I think up to that point, I'd been kind of naive. I was one of those people who was like, no, things are getting better and we can have it all. And instead, what I was hearing from young women is that there were things they wanted to do in their life. They had a lot of goals, but they really saw meeting a beauty ideal as absolutely essential. It was the thing that had to come before they could do any of those other things. Or maybe they felt they needed to do it even in order to have access to some of their other goals. They would say, I just can't go anywhere in life unless I lose 10 pounds first. Right. Or unless I, can figure out how to do my hair, or can do these other things. Those are extreme examples. Right. I don't think everyone is struggling that much. But I think the worries that those young women were having were actually not that unusual. I don't think they were limited to a certain age group of women or just to college students. I've heard women of all ages and backgrounds echo similar things where they feel like there have been these sort of barriers put around their lives and what they feel like they can and cannot do. Because they're so worried about how they look. And I want to be clear, I don't think there's anything wrong with these women. I think there's something wrong with our culture. I think it is something that we are born into that places pressure on us, right, from a very young age. And that's how we end up with beauty sickness. It's not a weakness in individuals, right? It's a sickness around us.
I've always realized or thought it started young, but I was quite taken aback by some of the findings in your book, some of the things that you talk about in your book. And you say that no matter what type of life young girls dream of, I know there's a good chance there are two things they really want to be, and that's thin and pretty. And you've said that girls start thinking about their ideal body at a very early age. What is at the root of this?
These really are some of the findings that I think shock people the most. The one that really hits people hard came from a survey that was conducted of 5-year-old girls. And they found that over a third of these 5-year-old girls said they were engaging in deliberate dietary restraint, meaning they were sort of cutting back their calories to try to be skinny. And the thing that is insane about that statistic is 5-year-olds do not understand dieting. 5-year-olds are still learning how to use a fork. They don't understand calories or metabolism or anything like that. When a 5-year-old girl tells you that she needs to lose weight or that she is dieting, all she is doing is repeating what she's heard from adult women around her. And so a lot of the source of these concerns comes from a culture that just beats young girls over the head with the message that being beautiful is what matters, that being pretty is what will bring them good things in life. And then when they hear their moms, their sisters, their aunts, their cousins chronically talking about dieting, about needing to lose weight, about needing to look different, they're going to hear that message. They want to be grown-ups, right? We all know that. We see how much little kids model us and emulate us. And so when that's what they hear us talking about, the message they learn is that this is what's important. This is what matters, is how my body looks to other people. So of course they're going to be affected by it.
I mean, that's so terrifying that we're in a society where 5-year-olds are thinking about their weight.
A lot of times these messages are passed down from parents without meaning to. I know a lot of parents who would say, well, I never talk like that in front of my daughter. And their daughter would say, yeah, you do. I hear it all the time. I had one of the women I interviewed told me if she had $1 for every time her mom complained about how fat her upper arms were, that she would be a millionaire, right? That it was such a constant topic of conversation in the home. And it's part of how we're trained as women to be always thinking about our bodies and thinking about how they look to other people. So it's not surprising then that that leaks out in our conversation with other people, that it turns into a bonding ritual with women we care about. But we always need to step back and ask ourselves, who's listening? Who's listening when we make these kinds of comments? And what kind of message are we sending to young girls? I fear that the message we're sending is that your body is a problem. It's always going to be a problem, and it will be a full-time job for you to manage it for the rest of your life so that it can be pleasing to other people. I think that's a really destructive set of messages.
Yes, and a terrifying one at that. I'm interested to know how far race and culture and socioeconomic factors and gender, because we don't really talk about men. The book is geared towards women. It's talking specifically about women and girls, and also how age affects the way we view our bodies and how we interact with the concept of beauty.
Let me start by talking about gender, because I think that's the most common question I get in any kind of public speaking situation is, what about men? And the first thing I'll say is that there absolutely are men who struggle with body image. And it is absolutely true that our culture provides a good deal of pressure to men as well for looking a certain way, right? That they're supposed to be muscular looking in particular is where a lot of men feel pressure. But I will also make the argument that women and men live in different social worlds when it comes to body image. For women, they still live in this world where the number one form of currency they have, of social capital they have, is their appearance. Right? We still live in this world where we will talk about how a woman looks before we will talk about anything else about her, right? No matter how irrelevant it is. Women think about how they look more. They talk about how they look more. They engage in more behaviors to change how they look. The diet industry is predominantly driven by purchases from women. The beauty industry as well. You can look at plastic surgery rates where internationally maybe like 85, 90, somewhere around that percent of plastic surgeries are done on women. We can't look at those trends and say, oh, gender's irrelevant here. It hits everyone the same. I don't think that's true. Part of what's going on, though, is that researchers specialize. And so I specialize in studying women. So it's not that I don't care about men and what's going on with their body image. I think there are a number of good thinkers doing work in that area. It's just not my area. So that's what I would say about gender. But you asked some other big questions there. You asked about race, about culture, about social class, about age. And I think it's really important to talk about those things and to recognize that pressures around beauty cannot be separated from racism, from classism. There are really powerful forces at work here, right? If you look at the growth of the skin whitening industry internationally, it's astonishing, right? And a lot of the companies that sell skin whitening creams also sell tanning creams to other women. right? So there's always going to be someone saying you're not okay the way you are. But I don't think we should pretend that the pressures are the same across groups. The beauty ideals we have tend to be driven by the people in power. And that's part of why we see so much racism reflected in our beauty ideals. And the intersection between classism and our beauty ideals is overwhelming. Because when you consider how women are expected to look today in order to be pleasing in the eyes of others, it doesn't just take time and dedication and worry. It takes money, and a lot of it. It takes dental work and dermatology and waxing and hair coloring, and I'm running out of things, eyelash extensions and very expensive makeup and the implements with which to apply the makeup. The list of things that women feel like they need to do in order to look acceptable has grown and grown. And as it grows, it costs more. Those are real literal costs. So if you are a woman without financial resources, our beauty ideals can actually function as a type of classism, as another way to sort of keep you in your place.
There is an argument that, spending power aside, if a woman chooses to go to a certain length to look a certain way, it doesn't necessarily mean that she's preoccupied with beauty. But then even if she is preoccupied with beauty and it gives her a certain power that she deems and many will deem necessary to navigate the world or navigate the system, and she's happy with that, then is that a problem?
I'm really glad you asked that. The first thing I would say is that women have to make decisions for themselves about how much they want to engage in beauty culture, how much they need to do so for their career path, for example. I'm not in a position to judge those commitments. But what I worry about is how many of us are doing so automatically without really thinking about it. We just sort of get carried along on this tide, or we think we need to do more than we actually have to do in order to, for example, just have a professional appearance. It depends on what career you're in too. But I'd also say if you are perfectly content with the amount of time and energy you're putting into your beauty practices, then that's great. Right? My message is for the women and the girls who feel like something isn't right here, right? Who feel like I don't really want to be doing this, or I'm doing all this stuff and I still don't feel okay and I'm never going to feel okay. That's who I'm really talking to. But I would also caution women who think about beauty as their primary means of achieving power and social capital. And the reason I would caution these women is because that is a really unstable foundation on which to build your power. If your career, if your influence relies on you looking a certain way, that is not real influence. It's never really yours. One person can take it away from you by calling you ugly, or life can take it away from you because you will age, and because age and beauty are really inextricably linked. I really encourage women to build their foundations of power and influence on something more stable than beauty. You do not get to keep beauty forever. It's not a foundation that's going to serve you well in the long run. The foundations that last are those that are based on relationships and expertise, right? Your connections with other people, with wisdom. Those are things that grow as you age. They don't, just magically expire the first time you get a wrinkle and gray hair. That's the kind of power we really need to be nurturing.
I think social media has been interesting in the role it's played within this journey of how we view ourselves. It's been lauded for its power to kind of rail against traditional beauty ideals, because it's really helped to galvanize movements such as the body positivity movement. I know that you don't necessarily think that this everybody is beautiful mantra is necessarily a positive thing. Why is that?
It's a great question. I will first say that representation absolutely matters. And to the extent that social media has allowed us to see a more diverse array of women and women's bodies and women's skin and women's hair, I think that's really important. I think it matters for all sorts of reasons that go well beyond body image. But in the end, if we're still talking about beauty, even if we broaden that beauty ideal, we are still distracting from other things. We're still taking airtime away from other conversations that could be about something besides how you look. Now, I think it's important to recognize that there's a little bit of privilege, maybe a lot present in my saying that. Right? There are some people whose appearance will be so marked by others that this is not really an option for them, right? To say like, well, could you try to focus on other things? They could say, well, yes, but the world will never let me. And I think we do need to recognize that. But there's also a big part of our population who could really, I think, be well served by just turning their attention elsewhere. Right, by just spending less time thinking about beauty, no matter what that beauty ideal is. What I often say is that I think it's important that we talk about beauty in a different way. But what I think is even more important is that we just talk about it less. Every time we don't talk about beauty, we don't talk about how a woman looks or what she weighs or what she's wearing, that is space. That's an open door to talk about something else. I want to know what conversations we're missing. I want to know what we could be talking about instead. That's what concerns me.
How far do you think we've moved along? How far do you think things have changed?
This is the question people always regret asking me because I'm going to sound like a terrible cynic here. I do not think things have gotten better. We have yet to see any overwhelming evidence that women have somehow been able to escape some of these forces, move beyond them, feel more confident, feel better about themselves. We're really not seeing that. Instead, what I think we're looking at, if you want to just talk about the last 20 years, for example, which is about how long it's been since I started teaching, in the last 20 years, if anything, we have seen the menace of beauty culture ratcheted up through social media of all varieties, through the types of television programming we see. It is truly hard to escape these forces, particularly if you're a young person. You want to stay engaged, you want to keep up with people, and it's really hard to move yourself into that social media system without getting just smashed over the head with messages about beauty, with ads about diet products, with YouTube cosmetics tutorials. It's really just everywhere.
Given all you've said, I'm curious to know how you personally have managed to detach yourself from the pressures that society's ideals of beauty place on us. How have you managed to navigate that?
I will say it is not true at all that I've somehow found a way to bypass all these pressures. If anything, the process of writing this book in some ways made it worse. I was writing about beauty ideals all day, which then makes you think about beauty ideals all day. And like many women, I'm also faced with what's happening to me as I age. I'm 44 years old now. I see wrinkles, I see gray hair, and I'm not magic, right? I can't just live in a world where I don't worry about beauty at all. I actually don't think anyone can. It's not what I'm advocating. I think we are always going to care how we look. I think that's a normal part of the human condition. What I want is a world where we can care about it less and where we can have a little more choice over the matter. I encourage people to approach it like a scientist, do an experiment. What would happen if you cut one practice, one product out? Right? What would you get in return for that? The pandemic has been interesting in this respect, right? It's put a lot of women in a position where they just didn't have access to their normal beauty and grooming routines. It's been fascinating for me to watch how that affects people differently. It'll be interesting to see whether anything changes when we go back.
And so what would you say is the cure? What's the cure for beauty sickness?
I would say that like any complex problem, there will never be a simple solution. Instead, I'm a psychologist. I tend to focus on individual behavior. I think there are other people doing really important work in structural factors that influence these types of beauty biases. But even on an individual level, you can change things. One of the easiest things we can do is to just stop body talk in the home. Stop appearance talk entirely, particularly if you have children. Just decide our house is going to be a place where we don't talk about how people look. It's actually not that big of a deal. You just make it a rule. It takes a few corrections along the way, and then it just becomes habit. And I've talked to a lot of parents who have done that, and they found it really refreshing. It just meant that they could talk about something else. And that's a great way to start, is just by changing how you talk. I think it's also really important to do everything you can to make your social media feeds a healthy place. If something is making you feel worse about how you look, if it's making you obsessed with losing weight, if it's making you engage in a lot of comparison, unfollow, hide, do whatever you need to do. You don't need to look at that content. Once it's gone, you're not going to miss it. Now, there are bigger steps we need to take beyond that, of course, but I think it's a start.
It's a strong start, I would say. Dr. Renee, thank you so much for coming on the show. One of my favorite interviews so far.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
And that's it for this week. Please do visit us on orbpodcast.com for links to the articles we discussed today. And if you haven't already done so, please do subscribe to our newsletter and to On Reflection podcast. My thanks to my guests Anita Bagwandas, Dr. Renee Engel, this week's brand partner Sunday Riley, and to you for listening to On Reflection.